So, I did the Barbenheimer challenge the other night. For those of you who don't know, that's where you go do a double feature and watch Barbie and Oppenheimer. It's picked up a lot of popularity and memery, probably because the movies are somewhat polar opposites, but I had time, and so I snuck into Barbie. And if you had told me that going to the theaters, I would have been more entertained and Barbie would have been more thought provoking than Oppenheimer, I would have called you insane. But here we are. Now, I want to state for the record before you assume that I'm just some dude who likes action movies and boobs and kung fu and explosions and bleh. I was more excited for Oppenheimer than I have been for pretty much any movie this year. It's combining two things that I dearly love. One, of course, is Christopher Nolan.
So I'm very pleased to be here.
The Genius, Memento, the Batman trilogy, The Prestige, Inception, Interstellar, which I think is his crowning achievement. And, I think we've all come to forgive him for Tenet and its muddled plot and bad sound mixing. And most of that guilt I lay at the altar of John David Washington, who I think is one of the most overrated, charmless, charismaless Nepo babies that I've seen in years. And makes me very scared for The Creator, which is due to come out, which looks like it has a very interesting plot and is very thought-provoking. And, maybe he'll be good in it. I think everybody deserves a fifth chance to ruin a $300 million blockbuster. The other thing that greatly excited me about this movie is I am really into Pacific War, World War II, Japanese history, and the Manhattan Project. I find it inherently fascinating, and I've been up nights reading the 50-page Wikipedia article talking about this, talking about Trinity, the building of the town in the middle of the desert, the Einstein-Salzgard letter. So I am a fan of this piece, this slice of history that we're in the middle of. So when I heard that Christopher Nolan's making a movie on this, I'm on board. However, I did also have some concerns coming into this movie, and most of my worries stemmed from the trailer. And the trailer very much reminded me of a movie that many of you may have already forgotten about, which was called First Man, starring Ryan Gosling, ironically, who's in the Barbie movie, but we're not here to talk about Barbie. First Man was a movie that I absolutely despised, and that at the time it came out, I remember there was this huge rally around it talking about how ingenious and beautiful it was and how amazing. And I think the director, I can't remember his name, was like a visionary. And for me, the movie was this incredibly joyless slog that had sucked all the majesty and the amazement out of the greatest achievement of human history, landing on the moon, and replaced it with this dour and emotionless melodrama about a sad man and his screaming shrew wife talking about how he was just a boy with a toy.
You're a bunch of boys. You don't have anything under control.
And when you look at the actual event in historical context, people were crying with joy around the world. There was so much hope in this amazing achievement. And to make a feature-length movie which featured none of this, I felt was almost a crime against humanity. It just wasn't good. And you know what? I've stood the test of time, because nobody cares about this movie anymore. Nobody goes, oh my God, let's go watch First Man. And when you go back and watch these threads, suddenly 5 years later, all these people are finally coming out of the woodworks and saying, you know what, this movie wasn't good. And so I fear that Oppenheimer was going to go down the same road. Now, I'm not going to call it the same, because yes, this movie was dour, was depressing, was serious, but we're dealing with a very serious subject matter. And yes, there was some yelling and screaming at him and the women in his life, but I think it was justified. So I think it doesn't exactly fit this mold. But what I am extremely worried about, because I'm looking at Rotten Tomatoes and it's getting 100% positive reviews, I think it is extremely hype. It's very fashionable to call this movie a masterpiece, but I absolutely disagree. I think there is an excellent 2-hour movie here buried inside of a mediocre 3-hour movie. Now, I would say spoilers, but the spoilers have been around for about 80 years now, so no worries. The movie opens with Oppenheimer as an older man talking to this kind of pseudo-government communist tribunal in a back room. Kind of the Red Scare, you get some McCarthyism feels. But what it's really using is that scene to act as a glue while Oppenheimer tells his life story to the tribunal. And this is a very common thing. We see this in a lot of biographical movies. and it works well. So he starts with his early life, and we follow Oppenheimer from life period to life period. You know, as a young man going to universities in Europe and America and talking with the eminent physicists of the day while they ask him, you know, do you hear the music? It's not about understanding the music. Do you hear it? And he says, yes, I hear the music. The music, of course, referring to these indecipherable characters that he writes on a blackboard, the physics equations that us mortal men will never be able to understand. And all of this is great. In fact, most of the movie that follows Oppenheimer's life up into the point where he invents the atomic bomb is great. It's entertaining, it's fascinating, it's involving. Where the movie falls apart for me, and I cannot fathom what Christopher Nolan was thinking, is something like a third of this movie's runtime, 1 hour out of the 3 hours, is devoted to this uninteresting subplot involving an ambitious politician who decides that after Oppenheimer's become world famous and invented the bomb, he decides to discredit him and call him a communist in the middle of the Red Square. And this is what the tribunal's all about. And this is something that, sure, it should be in the movie, but I cannot understand how they thought that an hour of this was either acceptable or entertaining. It's not. You don't care about this, and you don't care about these people. This is not what Oppenheimer was known for. In fact, Robert Downey Jr., who plays the evil politician, literally says in the movie, Trinity is what you're going to be remembered for. And I wanted to stand up and start clapping because we were 45 minutes into this irrelevant subplot, and I almost walked out of the theater twice. In the final hour of the movie, and this has been years since I'd done something like this, I almost walked out because I was so dragged down by this stakeless, boring subplot. And when I say it has no stakes, that's because at the end of all of this, what's really on the line of what happens is Oppenheimer loses his security clearance. Oh my God, oh my God, he lost his security clearance. He can't go into secret government meetings anymore. It doesn't matter. He's already world famous. Who cares about that? It might have well been an hour where he's an old man going to a Philly cheesesteak shop and there's an evil manager who won't stamp his Philly cheesesteak card to get the free Philly cheesesteak sandwich. It's like, we spend an hour on this, and not only that, at the end of the movie, he receives a medal and a presidential pardon, and they basically say, oh, you know, I'm sorry that we called you a communist in the 50s like we called everyone else a communist, but all is forgiven now. You were really a great guy. Now, I think this was put in here to show some kind of bittersweet ending that he was validated out of all the great things he did, but for me, it just only served to reinforce that we had wasted an hour of our time on this incredibly poorly paced 45 minutes to an hour. It is such a disaster. Okay, I need to calm down now because I'm getting a little heated up. But the best example I can think of, it's as if someone did an epic movie on Christopher Columbus, and it's a 3-hour movie. Great. Except that an hour and a half into the movie, he's already done his journey and he's returned to the kingdom. And as I kind of vaguely know, he was betrayed by some nobles. He ended up unpopular and he just kind of died in his bed penniless. And for some reason, the movie devotes half the running time to this. Why? You have to balance these things in respect to what this person is famous for and what the audience will be entertained by. Absolutely, you need these parts, but these parts need to be, 20 minutes. It needs to be a fifth of the movie, not half of the movie. And I find it supremely ironic that I was just talking about Asteroid City by Wes Anderson, and about 25% of this movie's runtime are devoted to these black and white parts where it becomes this play within a play, which is absolutely dreadful. And it's funny that all of the scenes with Robert Downey Jr. and this stupid subplot are black and white. I wonder if Wes Anderson and Christopher Nolan met in a room and said, hey, you know what? Let's play a giant trick in our audience. Let's just add crap. And for me, and I think this has been something that's happening a lot lately, movies are just getting too long. I understand why it's 3 hours. Sure, Oppenheimer's an amazing guy, and more importantly, it's Christopher Nolan. Editors are scared to talk to this guy. But I think that this movie desperately needed an editor, desperately needed a writer who is willing to erase some of those paragraphs, who's willing to say, you know what, this is not really adding to our movie. And I'll tell you right now, I absolutely believe that if all of these black and white parts, this entire subplot was edited out of the movie, because I can imagine the movie in my head, you would lose nothing. They're not interconnected. You would absolutely lose nothing. You keep the communist tribunal, because that's kind of the backbone of the movie where he tells his life story, but that's more than enough. We already get the impression what's happening, and the entire hour could have been summed up in a sentence while Oppenheimer talks to some ambitious young student as an older man, and he says, you know, in the old days, a politician tried to besmirch me as a communist, and they took everything from me. That's it. One sentence. We're done. Okay, let me take a deep breath now, and let's try to focus on some of the positive aspects of the movie, and there were many of them, primarily the cast. Now, the cast list is longer than the Bible, but I'm, of course, going to talk about the main players. Cillian Murphy, of course, as Robert Oppenheimer. Every scene he's in, you can't really take your eyes off him. He absolutely personifies that dark, brooding energy that you also see with him in Peaky Blinders. He's fabulous. I have no doubt that he'll probably be up for an Academy Award as a leading actor unless another serious candidate comes along, though I do think he should be in the running with Ryan Gosling from Barbie because, my God, Ryan Gosling throws himself into that role.
Closer I am to I'm coming with you.
And now opposite him, we have Matt Damon playing General Groves, Leslie Groves. And this, for me, is kind of the crux of the Oppenheimer story. And in this movie and the story, they play off of each other very much like Chernobyl. I hope you guys have seen that because it's excellent, but it's the same setup. It's the scientist and the military general. They're fundamentally initially at odds with each other. They have very different personalities. The general is the gruff go-getter by the book, and then, you know, Oppenheimer is kind of he's the intellectual scientist outside the line. But together they realize that it's more beneficial to put aside their differences, team up, and meet the need of humanity. You know, to save the world, to save their country. And this is nothing new. They also did this in the original atomic bomb movie with the worst title in the world, by the way, Fat Man and Little Boy. And Matt Damon, as usual, is no slouch. He has wonderful chemistry with Cillian Murphy. And, you know, he initially shows up, you have that 5 seconds where he kind of chuckle, like, aha, it's Matt Damon. But then he jumps right into it. And I think most of their scenes are the best scenes in the movie because those are the fundamentally relevant scenes for the interesting story that's being told. Florence Pugh is in the movie, of Marvel fame. She's going to be the replacement Black Widow. In fact, I see her in pretty much everything these days. I cannot believe that Christopher Nolan got her to take her shirt off, but she does so in multiple scenes. It's interesting to talk about her and Emily Blunt at the same time. Emily Blunt is playing Kitty, Oppenheimer's wife. And it got me thinking because, one, Florence Pugh is excellent in this movie. She's really well written. She plays kind of this seductive, clearly a little unstable, but deep and intense young communist who falls in love with Robert Oppenheimer, and they have kind of a cat and mouse relationship. And why I think about Emily Blunt, his other leading lady, is Emily Blunt is playing his wife, and she just kind of appears out of nowhere. It's very strange. I almost kind of sat up in my seat because we spend a lot of time establishing Florence Pugh as the interesting personality that she is in the movie, and then all of a sudden he just meets Emily Blunt at a party, and it's like, oh, we're getting married. And why it bothers me a little bit is because we hardly spend any time with Emily Blunt. Her character never gets established. She's just kind of this background piece for the majority of the running time. And then all of a sudden, in the last half an hour, she suddenly comes alive. She's suddenly screaming, and she say, oh, it was that guy, which is in reference to that horrible communist subplot. And then also in the middle of the hearing, she shows up, and she's suddenly this incredibly self-possessed, clever woman who's dodging and parrying the questions of the prosecutor. And for me, I think that's great, but it just came out of nowhere. And I really think that for artistic liberty, or if anything, just runtime, I feel like they should have smashed these two characters together. Because for me, Emily Blunt at the end of the movie is just Florence Pugh at the beginning of the movie. So both of those characters feel somewhat unbalanced, and it's a shame. An almost unrecognizable Josh Hartnett shows up, playing as one of Oppenheimer's co-scientist buddies in college. And is it just me, or are there some gay undertones here? I don't know. They spend a lot of time staring into each other's eyes. Last but not least, in the major roles, of course, we have Robert Downey Jr. playing this kind of well done, slimy politician slash scientist Louis Strauss, who he does great with the material he's given. It's just the less said about this whole portion of the movie, the better. David Krumholtz, whose name you probably don't recognize. The only thing I remember him from was The Santa Claus, way back when. And when you see him on screen, you're kind of reminded of how old and fat we're all getting. But I do want to say he does a great job in his part, and I think he adds a lot of humanity and kind of lightens it up a little bit. And as you need in these very long, very stark historical movies, you need a little bit of lightness added in. So every time he showed up on screen, I was happy. And a special mention goes to Casey Affleck, who shows up literally for 5 minutes, but he's great as this kind of government psychopath on the hunt for communists. And to be honest, I think his part could have been expanded to take over Robert Downey Jr.'s, and also Dane DeHaan plays kind of a bureaucratic government psycho. I think he could have replaced both those guys, been in the movie for 10 minutes instead of 5, and we all could have gone home happy. And last but certainly not least, Gary Oldman shows up kind of towards the very end of the movie playing Harry S. Truman, the president, in an absolutely badass scene where Oppenheimer walks in. He's long since passed his elation of inventing the bomb, and instead he tells the president he feels as if he has blood on his hands. And Gary Oldman looks at him and says, "You know what? Cry me a violin. I'm the one with the blood on my hands. I dropped the bomb. Nobody cares about you. I'm the one who has to live with it." And then he tells him to get the hell out of his office. And as Oppenheimer's walking out, he says, "Don't let that pussy in here again." It's great. And for me personally, the movie could have ended right there. As a matter of fact, I think it should have ended right there. That for me was the penultimate scene of the movie. After the bomb had exploded, after he dealt with both the fame and the fallout of it, I think that was a good place to leave it off. But no. Get ready to sit in your seat for another hour. Now, we can't talk about a Christopher Nolan movie without talking about the visuals, the cinematography, and they are all fabulous. You can absolutely smell the money and the time that went into this movie, that went into producing authentic sets where you really feel that you're in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. When they go about building the town in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, you can absolutely feel the legitimacy of that town that they've built, and you can feel the budget that the government spent on this because, and I'm glad they included it in the movie, this is a real quote, "The U.S. spent $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and they won." And thinking of the cinematography and visuals, it reminds me of the penultimate scene of the movie, which is the actual test of the atomic bomb at the Trinity site. And this scene is fabulous. I would say it lasts around 15 minutes, and it is so well edited and cut together in terms of the building of the tension of them about to launch this bomb. It's really, you absolutely have your eyes glued on the screen the whole time, and the effects are fabulous. Though I will say one downside is the atomic bomb explosion did not seem that big to me. And that may be actually historically accurate. This is well before the hydrogen bomb. We're all used to these giant world-ending explosions, but they may well have lit off just a small amount, and so that might have been the actual size of the atomic explosion. It was just, for the movie to have spent 2 hours building up to this point, I wanted to be absolutely awed, and I was not, but it's still a great scene. Sadly, another nitpick, which has been happening a lot in Nolan's movies, it started with, the Dark Knight series, where nobody could understand what Bane is saying.
"Peace has cost you your strength. Victory has defeated you."
And then you move on to Tenet, and nobody can understand what anybody is saying. The sound mixing in this movie is not perfect. I do think the soundtrack's very effective, but I'm a little critical of the places that it appears. So, for instance, there's a scene in the previews.
Robert, they just fired a starting gun.
But then when you get to the actual movie, that scene has these incredibly loud, violent violins playing over all the dialogue, and I could barely hear what anybody was talking about. Now, sometimes those sound effects are used very effectively. The bomb has gone off, they've dropped it on the Japanese, the entire village that they've constructed is celebrating, and Oppenheimer goes into this town meeting, and he still hasn't fully appreciated the horrible depth of what he's unleashed upon the world, and as he gives his, happy speech to all the gathered people, he suddenly sees this flash and imagines them all just burning up. The same thing, which is, of course, absolutely happening to the Japanese in real life. And that is a powerful scene. And, afterwards, he just kind of walks through the crowd. There are people talking, kissing, crying, having sex, and it's kind of showing humanity as this crazy jungle of people, these tribesmen, while he is the lone voice within the chaos, realizing the insanity of what he has given to the world. But then thinking of that and thinking of bad sound design, that having the atomic bomb explode around him actually happens again toward the end of the government tribunal. All of a sudden, while the prosecutor's talking to them, he has yet again another relapse where there's a giant flash and it's as if the atomic bomb is going off and there's silence. And unfortunately, I think it's far less effective here. In fact, the whole time I was just trying to struggle to hear what the prosecutor was saying while the music built up. And I think it fundamentally weakens the film by adding this in again. It's like less is more. It was so strong when placed there, but then when you do it a second time, it becomes less meaningful. And not only that, it's just another thing padding out the runtime. I did not need that again. So in conclusion, Oppenheimer, it's a beautiful, if flawed movie, and it's a movie that I would not pursue seeing again. I certainly would never want to see a director's cut of this movie. A 5-hour director's cut. If anything, if video stores still existed, I would much rather look for an executive cut. That's what I really want to happen now in Hollywood, is for them to release executive cuts. A nice, lean, 2-hour movie that I could really dig my teeth into here. So if you're watching this and you disagree, please feel free to comment down below. Argue with me. I like doing that. If you're watching this and you agree, I hope you tell people that. I think it's very, very fashionable right now to say that this movie was a masterpiece, and I'm sorry to say I disagree with that. But either way, thank you for putting up with my ramblings. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Consider subscribing if you haven't, and you have yourself a good night.